When we look at some of the most difficult conflicts in the world today, the roots often go way, way further back than we might think. And for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the seeds weren't just planted in the 20th century, they were sown in the desperate strategic calculations of World War I.
So, how did it all really start? The usual answers often point to 1948, with the founding of Israel, or maybe the decades of Jewish immigration before that. But here's the thing. While those moments are absolutely huge, they're not really the start of the story. The real origin is much more tangled.
The real answer? Well, it's a story of intrigue, of imperial ambition, and frankly, some serious double-dealing by the British during a global war. It's the story of how a series of conflicting promises were made to different groups, all for the very same piece of land, creating a legacy of conflict that we are still grappling with today.
Okay, so our story really begins with what you could call the war's weakest link. To get our heads around the promises that were made, we first have to understand the sheer desperation of the war itself. By the end of 1914, what everyone thought would be a quick war had ground to a horrifying, bloody halt. On the Western Front, armies were just dug into trenches, stuck in a brutal, immovable stalemate.
With the war completely deadlocked in Europe, British leaders, including a young Winston Churchill, started looking for another way to win. They came up with what Churchill called the indirect strategy. Basically, don't attack the enemy where they're strongest, hit them at their weakest point, their soft underbelly. And for Germany's alliance, that soft underbelly was the crumbling Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire became such an appealing target because for Britain, the Middle East was like a giant chessboard for their imperial interests. They absolutely had to protect the Suez Canal. That was their lifeline to India. They needed to push back against Germany's growing influence there. And, let's be honest, they were already secretly planning with France and Russia how to divvy up the Ottoman lands after the war. Their key tactic to make all this happen? To light a fire under the powerful new force of Arab nationalism and turn it against their Turkish rulers.
And this is where it all starts to get messy. This is where the web of promises begins. Desperate to win the war, Britain started making promises to pretty much anyone who could help them, without a lot of thought about what would happen later. This led to three major and fundamentally contradictory deals for the future of the Middle East.
First, Britain turned to the Arab nationalists. Now, for centuries, Arab peoples had lived under Ottoman rule, but a new idea was catching fire, a movement to break away and create a single independent Arab nation. Britain saw this and thought, perfect. This was their chance to spark a massive revolt from inside the Ottoman Empire.
But at the very same time, they were also in talks with the Zionist movement. You see, driven by horrific anti-Semitism in Europe, Zionism put forward the idea that Jewish people needed a state of their own, a national home, back in their ancestral land of Palestine. And this idea was gaining serious political momentum.
Okay, so here's the breakdown of how this tangled web was woven. Promise number one. In the Hussein McMahon letters, Britain promised Sharif Hussein of Mecca an independent Arab state if he'd lead a revolt. Promise number two. In the secret Sykes-Picot agreement, they promised France that they would just slice up the region between themselves after the war. And promise number three, with the Balfour Declaration, they promised the Zionist movement a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. One piece of land, three totally incompatible promises. You can already see the problem here, right?
So you have to ask, why on earth would they make all these conflicting pledges? Well, it really boiled down to wartime desperation and some, pretty terrible intelligence. By 1917, the war was going horribly. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George got it in his head that winning the support of what he saw as a powerful, globally influential Jewish community could help persuade America to send more troops and, crucially, keep a revolutionary Russia from dropping out of the war.
All right, so fast forward a bit. This brings us to the post-war carve-up. This is the moment when all those promises finally came due. In 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The war was over, and now Britain and its allies had to figure out which of their contradictory promises they were actually going to keep.
But before the diplomats could even sit down at the negotiating table, a bombshell drops. The new Bolshevik government in Russia, wanting to expose what they saw as the cynical games of the imperial powers, just opened up the old government archives and published all the secret treaties, including the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Suddenly, the secret plan to carve up the Middle East was out in the open for everyone to see, sparking massive outrage and suspicion in the Arab world.
And what made this look even worse was the kind of language being thrown around at the time.
Over at the Versailles Peace Conference, the American president, Woodrow Wilson, was talking all about a new world order, one based on the idea of national self-determination. For the Arab peoples who had fought and died alongside the British, this sounded like their promise of independence was finally about to come true.
But, as you can probably guess, Wilson's grand ideals quickly slammed into the hard wall of imperial reality. When he came to the Middle East, this whole principle of self-determination was basically thrown out the window. That secret Sykes-Picot agreement, a backroom deal between two colonial powers, was given more weight than any promises made to the people who actually lived there.
The way they did this, the mechanism was something new called the mandate system. Now, officially, under the new League of Nations, Britain and France would just administer these old Ottoman lands until they were ready for self-rule. In reality, it was just Sykes-Picot with a fancy new name, colonialism in disguise. The promise of a unified Arab state was shattered, and the entire region was cut up with borders literally drawn on a map in London and Paris.
Now, this whole partition plan set the stage for conflicts all over the region. But nowhere were the consequences more tangled and, frankly, more explosive than in the brand new British mandate for Palestine. This is where two of Britain's big promises were put on a direct collision course. To really get a picture of the situation on the ground, you just need to remember one single number: 8%. In 1914, back when all these promises were first being made, that was the size of the Jewish population in Palestine. The vast, overwhelming majority were Arabs, the very same people who had been promised their independence.
And this is the absolutely crucial part. When Britain established its rule over Palestine, it wrote the Balfour Declaration directly into the legal framework of the mandate. This move basically enshrined the promise to the Zionist movement into law, and it officially swung the doors wide open for Jewish immigration. For the Arab majority, this felt like the ultimate betrayal. Their country, they believed, was being given away right from under them, without their consent.
And if you want to know the thinking behind this, just listen to this. A confidential memo from Arthur Balfour himself. He wrote that Zionism was of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. I mean, it's right there in black and white. The rights and the dreams of the people already living there were just explicitly dismissed.
From here, the consequences just unfolded, almost like a tragic, predictable script. The British mandate made it easier for Jewish immigrants to come and buy land. Then, in the 1930s, as the Nazis rose to power in Europe, that immigration surged. Tensions over land and power just kept escalating until they exploded into widespread violence. By the 1940s, Britain had totally lost control. In 1948, they just packed up and left, the State of Israel was declared, and the first Arab-Israeli War kicked off immediately.
So in the end, Britain's desperate strategy to win World War I left behind this incredibly deep and lasting wound. By encouraging two powerful nationalist movements and promising both of them the same exact home, they set the stage for 100 years of conflict. And it leaves all of us with a really tough question. How do we even begin to reckon with the legacy of these century-old promises and betrayals that still shape our world in such profound ways?